I invite everybody to use the microphone, please. And this will make it easier then for the recording to be discernible. And I would just welcome everybody. It's a delight to have such a distinguished set of experts lined up for this double bill day devoted to understanding Japan's foreign and security policy, China's foreign and security policy, China's narratives, and have fruitful discussion in the first leg of a double bill, which will be recorded and go online. I will briefly introduce the speaker and the discussant. Tobias Harris, a world authority on Japanese politics. I remember starting to read, as many of us in this room, your blog, Tobias Observing Japan, since its earlier inceptions, and hearing about you also when you were a student, an MA student at Cambridge University, where I did my PhD. Tobias has then transitioned to political risk analysis at Teneo, briefly at CAP, and in the process has published this massive doorstopper of a book, which is The Iconoclast, the only English language book on Abe Shinzo and his legacy and his political legacy. And I understand that the time is ripe for an update on the book and potentially on a Japanese language translation. Tobias now works at the GMF as Deputy Director for Asia. And what he's going to talk about today is also perfectly tightly linked with your new position at the GMF, which is concerned with transatlantic relations. And we often talk about Europe and the US aligning on their Asia policy or China policy, but less so about the other link, which is the EU-Japan, or Europe-Japan link, I should say, because you're going to talk about more than just EU and Europe, but also about NATO and those links. And we are very fortunate to have Matteo Dian, who's Associate Professor in Political Science and International Relations at Bologna University, the longest continuing university in the world, as it happens, and the university in Italy with the strongest political science department. And we are very lucky to have a long-time scholar of East Asian international relations with a particular knack on Japan's international relations. So I think this is a perfect fit. I apologize on the record for having arranged a manual, but but it's also because there was a specific fit with the expertise at hand, which makes this alignment of stars particularly fruitful. And I'm sure that the conversation will be very fruitful even in the Q&A part of our discussion. And I invite you all to introduce yourselves when perhaps at the end of the lecture you will pose questions, comments, critiques of Tobias' talk. So without further ado, Tobias, thanks for being here, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giulio. Thank you. I'm at a slight disadvantage because he treated me to a very nice lunch beforehand. So if I'm a little slow of thought, it's his fault because I had such a nice lunch. And I don't know how anyone can work in this setting. It's beautiful, and it's really a pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity. So thank you, and really thank you all for being here. I think I think there couldn't be a better time to talk about this. I think, we're probably about 2 months now from the G7 in Hiroshima. Japan, I think, really Japan having the EU or the G7 presidency now a year after Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. It's, really such a unique opportunity now to really put some flesh on this, there's been lots of talk about Western unity or unity among the democracies over the last year. Japan is probably maybe best positioned to put that agenda together. I mean, for a number of reasons that we can talk about why Japan might be well suited. And there's a reason why, of course, I used this picture from just this week. I mean, very timely to be talking about this because, of course, we had Prime Minister Kishida becoming the last G7 leader to visit Kyiv. And we shouldn't make too much of the idea that he was the last leader. I think, of course, he's wanted to go for some time, but Japanese domestic politics complicated his ambitions. And of course, the timing worked out in that it also gave us the contrast between Kishida in Kyiv and Xi Jinping in Moscow meeting with Vladimir Putin. So we had, symbolically at least, I think, what's at stake in the world right now, I think was made very clear this week. And if we certainly look at what Kishida said when he was in Kyiv, I think there's a lot to take from that. So I would say that when we think about the visit and why we should care about that and why we should be thinking about Japan and Europe more broadly, and first of all, that visit really cements the role that Japan has played over the last year in responding to a major European security crisis, and signals that for Japan, since the crisis began last year, has not acted, as the Japanese proverb goes, that the crisis is not a fire on the opposite shore. And that was, I think, a major development for Japan, and we shouldn't undervalue that, that from really even before the crisis began, that it was clear that Japan was taking it seriously and that it saw it as a significant global crisis that required Japan joining a global response. And just to review what that response has been, the Kishida government has joined with the United States, the EU, and other countries in imposing sanctions on Russia. And really, I think to an extent that I think even on the brink of the crisis, I think there were some questions whether Japan would do much more than it did in 2014. And very quickly, those doubts were swept away. I mean, Japan did sign on to some of the most aggressive financial sanctions, the central bank sanctions, and I think went much further than I think was anticipated. It's gone quite far with financial assistance, and of course, most recently supplemented with $5.5 billion of additional financial assistance for Ukraine. We've seen Japan send non-lethal military aid, which is a significant gesture, and could soon include more lethal military aid. There's certainly talk that they might change those restrictions. We've seen Japan admit Ukrainian refugees, maybe not in enormous numbers, but again, we're talking about just compared to past practice. I mean, it's quite a remarkable step. And I think just more broadly, you saw in a very short time the Prime Minister abandon Japanese-Russian policy that that had been pursued not just by Abe, but really for a number of decades, just moving ever closer to having practical negotiations with Russia. Maybe the hope that Russia could become a partner of sorts for Japan in the region. And very quickly, Kishida saw that there was something different about this crisis and that it really required a true change on Japan's part. And so, yes, I think Japan still is buying some fossil fuels from Russia, and there's still some trade. But clearly, the idea that you're not going to see a resumption of the kind of talks that we saw during the Abe years, for example. I mean, I think you now have maybe something of a new Cold War, at least between Japan and Russia, if not necessarily between Japan and China, and that's to be discussed later. This was not, we shouldn't think of this as altruism, though. I mean, I think, of course, I think Japan cared very much and was very moved by the impact the war had on Ukrainian civilians. And I think, this might be a separate discussion, but I think it had a major role to play in some of the security policy changes we've seen over the last year. But this was not just Japan feeling that it had to help Ukraine, nor should we assume that this was just the United States was pressuring Japan to step up. That Japan was dragged along. I don't think that was the case either. Nor was I think Japan motivated by fears of being left out. Going back to the 1990-1991 Gulf crisis, when Japan was, of course, shamed for its checkbook diplomacy. I don't think those are the motivating factors here. Rather, I think we really have to look at how Japan has articulated its national strategy over the past decade, both in the original Abe government national security strategy back in 2013, and then the update that we got in December of last year. And Japan's approach to Europe, I think it tells you a lot about Japan's strategic thinking, how it's thinking about the world, what its priorities are, and how it wants to achieve its national interests. And so this is just a great learning opportunity for us to understand Japan better, and also just for checking Japan's progress in its pursuit of its national interests. So first, I think before we even talk about Europe and Japan's strategy, I think it's worth just talking about what Japan's strategy actually is. And I think when you look at both the December national security strategy and of course in the previous one, it's in some ways very straightforward. That Japan's articulated national interests are: it's going to defend its sovereignty and preserve its independence and territorial integrity. It's going to defend the lives and the bodies and the property of the Japanese people, preserve Japanese cultures and tradition, and of course values like freedom and democracy and the rule of law, universal values, so to speak. I think it really bears stressing, and when you look at Japan's strategic document and maybe look at the US documents, it is very striking the extent to which, unlike in the US documents, which basically have great power competition with China as their framing principle, that is not how Japan has approached its articulation of its national security strategies. That it is focused on what are our national interests first and foremost. It is not using its national security strategy is not a China strategy by default or by a de facto China strategy. It is genuinely thinking about what does Japan need to do to secure itself in what Kishida has repeatedly described as a historical turning point. I think it's also just worth appreciating, and this is not new. Of course, you can go back decades, maybe even to the pre-war era, just how fundamentally economic Japan's conceptualization of its interests are, that it really is thinking about, consistently thinking about the kind of world system there needs to be to ensure Japan's prosperity, its continued prosperity. And I think with that, of course, is the constant sensitivity to Japan as a resource-poor country, dependent on imported raw materials, dependent on imported energy, dependent on overseas markets. And I think all of those concerns, those are all very old concerns, and Japan has pursued those goals. It's pursued markets overseas and resources overseas, and has taken a number of different approaches. But now I think there's an especially acute sense of Japan's need for global economic integration and certainly regional economic integration now, because Japan is sensitive to the fact that its population is shrinking, the Japanese market is shrinking, its companies have to go out. There is no alternative for Japan's prosperity than to be integrated with the world and to find sources of prosperity and growth overseas. And so really, I think, particularly, I think the updated national security strategy was actually very, very clear on this. On articulating this recognition that Japan has depended on an international community based on coexistence and shared prosperity that was created primarily by democracies, including Japan. And so access to this rules-based international order, this economic community governed by rules to promote greater integration, this order facilitated Japan's recovery and development after World War II. And in light of Japan's declining population, access to this community will enable Japan to enjoy continued prosperity into the 21st century. And I really think for Japan, this slogan of a rules-based international order, I don't think it's an empty slogan. I think, perhaps sometimes when the United States talks about the rules-based international order, it might be vulnerable to charges of hypocrisy. I am sensitive of what this month is the 20th anniversary of. That is inescapable for the United States. The United States, as powerful as it is always reluctant to be too bound by rules and institutions, and that is just the reality. I think post-war Japan knows what it has gained from the existence of a rules-based international economic order, and would like to continue to enjoy that rules-based economic order. And so I think that is just fundamental. I mean, it is. I don't think you can understand Japan's conceptualization of its security and of its grand strategy without understanding that. And again, just to pull another line that I have up here on the slide, based on this international order, we have enjoyed the fruits of peace, stability, and economic development in the international community through globalization. There are times maybe where Japan would not be quite as open about talking about globalization. I think clearly one change over the last 10 to 15 years has been, I think, a willingness to be a little more explicit about this and to recognize Japan's role as a pillar of this and as a promoter and a maintainer of this system. Of course, this is where we do get to China. And it is worth noting that Japan, in its national security strategy, refers to countries that do not, some countries that do not share these values. And so the first thing to note about this is that Japan does not single out, it is not identifying all authoritarian countries or all autocracies. And this, of course, is a subtle difference from the United States, which is now using this framing of democracies versus autocracies. But it is not shy about identifying the challenge that these countries that do not share these values do pose. And in the strategy, it identifies the ways in which this challenge is being manifest. So countries that are, of course, using military, non-military means to violate territorial integrity. In this case, explicitly naming Russia. I think another big concern in the strategy is threats to the global commons, so cyberspace, space, maritime, the electromagnetic spectrum, hybrid warfare, and so on. I think disinformation is another, sort of the information space, I think, is another concern. Economic issues, more explicitly economic issues, so supply chains, critical infrastructure, technology competition, and increasingly talking about these economic issues as security issues. And I think that's something that, again, has become increasingly explicit in Japan's strategic documents. And then, of course, just the legal acts against businesses and universities to take their privileged information and steal their technology and steal their trade secrets. So all of these, I think, are really where the Japanese government is concerned. And the bottom line of it, and I pulled this quote out here because, again, I think it's a very striking quote. It has become clear that the peace and security of international society cannot be guaranteed solely by globalization and interdependence. So in other words, this is not a self-perpetuating system, that it has to actively be maintained by Japan and other countries working in concert to identify the challenges posed to it, to make the changes to cooperation amongst themselves, to strengthen rules, to strengthen institutions, to actually maintain the system. They cannot assume that the system will be maintained if integration is advanced, that you have to actually act to preserve it. So I think when it comes to actually how Japan's going to pursue this, of course, the strategy, was most ambitious and most talked about for the changes it announced for Japan's hard security policies. Of course, increasing defense spending, acquiring the capacity to strike targets overseas, basically now recognizing that Japan is going to take primary responsibility for defending itself. So that was put very explicitly in the national security strategy. So that, I think, if we're doing concentric circles, the innermost circle is Japan recognizing that it has to be more responsible for defending its own territory. But then, of course, you take a step, the next circle out is cooperation with the United States. And I think, first and foremost in Japan, it just remains, if we want to talk about an Abe doctrine and looking at how Abe put down a blueprint for Japanese foreign policy and security policy, clearly the first principle is that Japan has to do whatever it takes to ensure the U.S. is committed to Japan's security, committed to regional security, and is present, and really present not just as a security actor, but also an economic rulemaking, hence the insistence on the U.S. returning to TPP, and just also as a political actor in the region. And so first and foremost remains cooperation with the United States. Then the next circle out is cooperation with like-minded countries within the region. And of course, that includes Australia and India first and foremost. And of course, I recommend everyone look at the speech that Kishida gave in India this week. He's been quite busy this week, really laying out sort of a new articulation of a free and open Indo-Pacific concept in India, and really emphasizing the importance of India as a partner, both within the region, but then also India as sort of a voice of cooperation with the global South. And so clearly, after the United States, you have Australia and India, maybe over time as Japan and South Korea try to build on some of the breakthrough we've seen in the last few weeks. Maybe South Korea will also enter that circle. It was certainly one of the big blind spots from the Abe years. But that's the next circle. And then sort of maybe the next circle outward are the extra regional like-minded countries. And I think clearly perhaps the most important among those would be Europe, both the European Union as an institution, but then also leading European powers, including Germany, France, the UK, Italy, and others. So let's then think about what we've actually heard and what we've learned about Japan's approach to Europe over the last decade. And I apologize for this big block of text up here, but this is from the 2013 National Security Strategy, and it's worth noting that there's actually relatively little, and certainly nothing like this in the 2022 National Security Strategy. But I thought this quote, which was, so this was drafted in, the first year of the second Abe administration, has been, I think, describes pretty clearly what Japan has tried to do over the subsequent decade, and what I think the Kishida government is continuing to try and do. I'm not going to read this all. It is quite a lot of Japanese bureaucraties. But I think maybe the essence of it is really that part in the middle is sort of recognizing that maybe, and does not say to a greater extent than to the United States, but I do think there's an implication that when you look at their approaches to the world, that actually Japan and the European Union and major European countries actually have similar ways of thinking about world order and a similar commitment to the rules-based economic order, sort of recognizing that rulemaking for the world is an active process, that it's not going to just hold up on its own, and that really the countries have to work together to defend these values. And so I think Japan, and this was not, I think it bears stressing, this was not something that I think Japan just took as a given for, I think Japan had to come to this understanding. I think, and I'll pull this out. So I've been reading through the posthumous memoir, which is really more of an oral history that was published by two Yomiuri Shimbun journalists based on interviews with Abe after he left the premiership. And I thought this quote, this is what Abe said about the European Union. I thought this was just so fascinating. This is my translation. To be honest, I thought that meeting with leaders of major European powers like Germany and the United Kingdom would be enough. But it was my private secretary, Mr. Imai, who convinced me of the EU's importance. He said to me repeatedly, once the EU's internal rules are established, they will surely become international rules in the future. Therefore, Japan should be involved before Europe makes the rules. And so, I think it's so telling that, essentially that Abe, who generally, a Japanese leader with a pretty good sense of the world and a foreign policy vision, didn't intuitively grasp the importance of the European Union. He had to be guided towards understanding that. And I think there's so it's worth stressing this was not a frictionless process. This is not something that was just natural that Japan woke up to this. I think it really took an effort. Also, really and clearly by Abe's advisors as well, sort of pointing the way towards seeing that the potential for Japan EU cooperation and Japan cooperation with leading European states was an opportunity for Japan to advance its interest. But it had to come to this. It was not naturally occurring. And even I think among the bilateral relationships, and I'll point to the ways in which there's been quite a lot of progress, among those various bilateral relationships. Again, not necessarily frictionless. I think Abe in his, in this memoir, he recounts I think actually there's an undercurrent of actually a lot of frustration with Angela Merkel. I mean, he recounts the number of times she visited Japan over her very long tenure, that I think he counted 6 times, and only 3 of them were explicitly for bilateral meetings in Japan, that 3 of those times were for multilateral summits. He's critical of how overly solicitous of China, both Germany and Britain under David Cameron were. So that basically recognizing that part of the effort was just explaining to European leaders and trying to get them to understand the challenge that China was posing to them, not just to Japan, in greater detail and just with greater clarity. And so he recounts at length trying to do that in summit meetings. Despite some of the friction, though, despite I think some of the slow, gradual awakening to the potentials of cooperation between Japan and Europe, it was quite. I think that the last decade, I think, was really quite remarkable, and I think it'd be hard. I think if you were to compare the previous decade, the decade leading up to 2013 with the decade since, I think it'd be clear that there was nothing like what we've seen over the past decade. So just starting with the political and economic partnership. Of course, most significantly, you had the Strategic Partnership Agreement and the Economic Partnership Agreement, both signed in 2018, which, of course, had been started under Abe's Democratic Party of Japan predecessors, but didn't really go much of anywhere. And really, I think the timing of those agreements, I think, is quite important. Really, I think they were the purest expression of Japan's recognition, in particular, that Japan and the EU are united in a shared commitment to the maintenance of a rules-based international order, sort of recognizing that both had much more to gain and a lot to lose from the loss of a rules-based international order. And of course, the timing, concluding an agreement in principle in 2017 and signing the final agreement in 2018, I'm not going to say that it was a hedge against the United States, but clearly there was a sense of Japan and the EU needing to strengthen their ties in light of the protectionist turn in the United States. And again, what Abe said on the occasion of the signing of this EPA will vividly demonstrate to the international community the firm political will of Japan and the EU to lead the world, keeping the flag of free trade waving high. And so, again, I don't know if we can call this hedging, but certainly I think a recognition that within the G7, sort of among the advanced industrial democracies, that there's much more lifting that Japan and the EU needed to do together to hold up a rules-based international order. That they couldn't assume that the United States would just do the work, or that the work could just be done between the US and Japan together, or the US and the EU together, that it really did require Japan and the EU maybe actually being willing to push back against Washington sometimes. And I think neither, I think both the EU and Japan are careful sometimes that they're pushing back. Maybe the EU is a little more confident in its willingness to push back against the United States than Japan is. But I do think there's a recognition in Tokyo that they value the role that Europe can play as a counterweight within a G7 context, in particular opposing US protectionist impulses. I think this might also just be partly a function of scale, where Japan, I think in general, I think Japan sees itself as a smaller country in a world of continental-sized countries that have a lot of power. I think, for example, I think the same impulse guides Japan's approach to India, that it sees India as the basically continental scale counterweight within Asia to China. I think Japan sees the EU as a country that could punch bigger than it does maybe, and almost would like it to. And of course, recognizing that it's a bigger market, that it has more people, and that it has more influence as a rule maker globally. And so I think, right now, I think we're seeing it exactly. I think Japan has been very reluctant to openly counter the US, for example, on the Inflation Reduction Act. But I don't think they've been unhappy that the EU has been pushing back and trying to counter the latest manifestation of protectionist impulses in the United States. And so clearly, I think there was a recognition in Tokyo that that when it comes to actually protecting an open economic order, the EU was could be more of a partner than it had been in the past, and that there was work to do in building that. Just as an aside, I think this thinking about the EU probably also explains some of Japan's confusion about Brexit. And I think Tokyo was alarmed about the impact it would have on Japanese companies that had invested in the UK, and that was probably most important. But I get the sense, when you talk to Japanese officials, that I think there's maybe some confusion that the British would voluntarily leave a bloc that allowed them to carry more weight in the world, that would extend their influence globally. And that perhaps there's a sense in Tokyo that, if the British really didn't want their membership in the EU, Japan would be happy to have it. I think I've certainly heard Japanese make jokes of that nature before. Sort of a recognition that there's value in having weight in a world where you have countries the size of China, size of Russia, it's a world where bigness matters. And Japan is, I think, acutely aware of that. So the other dimension where we've seen, I think, cooperation advance is security partnerships. And this is, of course, more on a bilateral basis. With the UK-Japan relationship probably the most advanced at this point, where we've seen in 2017 the Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation, the start of a 2+2 dialogue in 2015, the conclusion of their AXA, the Acquisition and Cross-Servicing Agreement, most recently a Reciprocal Access Agreement. Apparently, and this is again something that Abe writes about, or spoke about in the posthumous memoir, apparently Theresa May actually proposed to him that you have a formal UK-Japan alliance, which Abe was slightly taken off guard by and demurred, but certainly a sign of how the kind of trajectory of Japanese UK security cooperation. While the Japan-UK defense relationship is probably the most developed, we can't ignore the other ones. I think its relationship with France is probably right behind the Japan-UK relationship. You have a 2+2 with France that predates the one with the UK starting in 2014. You've had bilateral maritime exercises with France, and France, of course, is a resident Pacific power, which I think makes things easier. We've seen bilateral exercises with Germany as well. It looks like the bilateral relationship, security relationship with Italy is right behind these other ones. Naturally, I think the joint development of a next generation fighter aircraft between Japan, the UK, and Italy is, I think, an important milestone as well. So all of these show, I think, at least a direction. I think, and we can talk about the significance, but sort of the weight of each of these steps. But I think as a recognition that they have things to talk about and things to work together on. I think it's been clear. And of course, in addition to these bilateral relationships, you also have Japan and NATO increasingly deepening their cooperation. And I think in the case of NATO cooperation, I think the change is really remarkable because I think it's basically been compressed into 5 years. I think even if you look at, it's always interesting as a data point, if you look at the Japanese MOFA webpage and you look at the page of bilateral relationships, and that sort of gives you a list of bilateral interactions. And before 2017, maybe one item a year. It's very, not high level. And since 2017, basically after Secretary General Stoltenberg's visit to Japan in 2017, you see the agenda getting much more crowded, the tempo of meetings getting much busier. And then, of course, much of that then has happened in the last year with Prime Minister Kishida attending the NATO summit, Stoltenberg visiting Japan again earlier this year. And I think if you look at the contrast between the 2017 visit and the visit this year, the difference is really remarkably striking. You had Stoltenberg saying that this year, no NATO partner is closer or more capable than Japan. I think that tells you something about the tone of where Japan-NATO cooperation is now. And I think At this point, I think more has been done on the political level. I think, speaking about kind of shared interest and shared challenges that NATO and Japan face, and talking about now, certainly in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the inseparability of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. But I do think there's work to do, maybe to fill in some of the substance behind the slogans. And I think, it's worth stressing, I think, the Japanese government itself, I think, is very careful not to overstate the practical significance of some of these security partnerships with European countries and with NATO. That I don't think they expect that, in the event of a significant crisis in Asia, in the Taiwan Strait, for example, or the Korean Peninsula, I don't think they're expecting that European countries are going to do much to guarantee Japan's security or ride to the rescue in the event of a crisis. I think that is not the purpose of this cooperation. I think, I think they're hoping that there's areas where perhaps cyberspace cooperation, some of the more intangible areas of cooperation, that there might be opportunities to train together and to learn from each other and to strengthen their capabilities in that area. But I think, at least for the moment, it is much more of a political initiative rather than something that is really advancing Japan's ability to secure its security interests. Maybe this is somewhere between the political and the practical. But I do think part of Japan's engagement on security issues with NATO and with European partners, is trying to get them to think about what, for example, they would do in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, thinking ahead of time, or learning lessons from Ukraine about that regional security crises can have far-reaching global impacts, recognizing their vulnerabilities, their supply chain, the possibility of supply chain disruptions, recognizing their dependence on China now, doing things now that could then make the threat of sanctions in the event of an invasion more credible. That right now, if you're overly dependent, it's hard to credibly threaten sanctions. And so I think getting Europe to think more about that, I think, is certainly one of Japan's goals in the pursuit of this security cooperation. But we also, the political signaling is important. I think closing ranks with other democracies on the importance of defending a rules-based order, recognizing that the kind of violation of territorial integrity and sovereignty that Russia's invasion of Ukraine represents is, in fact, a threat to some of the most fundamental post-1945 global norms. And that Japan has to stand with European countries in opposing that. I think that is important. Even if it's more about symbolism and signaling than about tangible cooperation. So just to conclude, just thinking about where things go from here, clearly we're now at the point where I think they have now, Japan, the EU, and European partners in bilateral settings have recognized that they are partners in upholding a rules-based international order. They see the value, they see that they share goals, they see that they both, the rhetoric about a shared commitment to a rules-based international order is not just empty, that the order is under threat, and that they need to do more to maintain it, to preserve it, and to deepen that cooperation. But I think when you look back at the Strategic Partnership Agreement, the promise of Japan-EU cooperation has not been fully realized. There's a lot of areas where I think progress. They are trying to convert that into more tangible progress, but they really now have to push ahead with it. That whether it's digital trade, whether it's countering economic coercion, whether it's advancing cooperation on strategic infrastructure in the global South. Developing world, whether it's working together on climate and energy, or the development of emerging technologies, or reconstruction and stabilization of Ukraine. There are all these areas where I think there's been a lot of agreement on the priorities and what needs to happen, but now just needs to be more more follow through. And some of that, I think, is also on the European side. I mean, of course, we've seen European strategic documents recognizing Japan as a partner in all of these areas. But there needs to be a sense, I think, of urgency and a sense that the cooperation with Japan ought to be a strategic priority for the European Union. And that needs to be felt, I think, throughout the institution, which, I mean, you talk to Japanese about the European Union, and I think the first thing they note is the difficulty of understanding the different institutions and the challenges of getting EU institutions to make decisions. And so I think there's a certain frustration on the Japanese side on that score. But it just needs to be a priority for Europe as well as for Japan. And I think the other area, I think, is just more frank discussions between Japan and the EU about China. And this does not mean a lecture by Japan. This does not mean Japan just saying you have to get it, and repeating its concerns. Rather, I mean, I think Japan and the EU actually are in a similar place on China, even though Japan maybe feels it can't be quite as explicit about this because of its relationship with the United States. But for example, there's a quote from when Medi Minister Nishimura was in Washington in January. He gave a speech at CSIS where he said, quote, "Authoritarian countries have amassed tremendous power, both economically and militarily. This is an undeniable fact. A complete decoupling is also already impossible." And so I think Japan and the EU are both in the situation of recognizing the risks from economic interdependence with China, recognizing that the era of naive engagement with China, hope that if you just trade and invest more in China, that you would perhaps China's behavior would mellow. Clearly, that era is over, and it is now, I think, up for Japan and the EU to figure out something new and finding some middle ground between decoupling and naive engagement. And Japan and the EU, I think, are much better placed to have that discussion because I don't think it is politically taboo in either place to acknowledge that you're not going to completely isolate China from the global economy, that China exists, that the business communities in Japan, the EU, and the United States, which is easy to forget sometimes if you just listen to what's said in Washington, all continue to want to trade and invest with China. And so there needs to be a discussion about how do you manage the risks, how do you reduce the risks, how do you reduce vulnerability to economic coercion, but still finding a way to have, as the Japanese foreign policy formula puts it, a stable, constructive relationship with China. And clearly, I think both Japan and the EU feel a need not to basically have the terms of their relationship with China dictated by domestic politics in the United States. And I think there's a risk of that if they can't devise their own approach and kind of have this frank discussion amongst themselves. And so I think that is urgent. I think it has to happen, and it has to happen between the two of them. Because I don't know, I mean, particularly with the United States entering a presidential election cycle, I don't think they can count on the United States to do that thinking for them and to do that work for them. And so that, I mean, I think it's an opportunity, but it's also an imperative when it comes to cooperation between Japan and the EU. So just to conclude, clearly I think we're in an era where trilateral cooperation between Japan, the US, and Europe is probably as important or more important as it was, say, in the 1970s when the G7 was born. I mean, clearly, there are enormous shared challenges. There are real threats to the rules-based international order that have to be addressed. They might have less relative weight in the world collectively, but they still, I think, bring tremendous agenda-setting power globally. And so it is important for that coordination. And while the US and Japan and US-Europe legs of that trilateral cooperation, I think, are very strong, institutionalized, developed, there are a lot of habits of engagement in those bilateral settings. The Europe-Japan leg still, there's a lot of work to do to build it up to, I think, the same place that the other legs are at. And I think it would be better for trilateral cooperation if Europe and Japan were able to speak with one voice on more issues, and were able to push back sometimes against the United States when the United States is less than fully committed to a rules-based international order. That there's a need for Japan and the EU to be able to have those conversations with the United States. They are getting there. Things are better than they were a few years ago. And clearly, I think the Ukraine crisis has pushed things along. But for the sake of the preservation of international order, I think it's imperative that they move faster. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Tobias. We have the good fortune of having the author of a book, actually in Italian, which, if I remember correctly, is China and the US and Global Order. And I haven't mentioned it earlier, but Matteo has also written on US-Japan relations, the Eagle and the Chrysanthemum, on identity politics in China and Chinese and Japanese foreign policy, and also a co-authored book on China's new regional initiatives. And Matteo is always figures highly in my acknowledgement sections in my writings, because he's of enormous help with his comments in sharpening my thoughts and even giving more conceptual clarity. So thanks, Matteo. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giulio, for the kind words. Thank you very much, Tobias, for a very insightful and comprehensive presentation. I want to say that I would broadly agree with many things. So I will just ask you to maybe go in some more details on something I'm curious about. You touched upon a number of things on the global role of Japan, on EU and Japan. So the first thing that I would just highlight is the importance of the idea in the Indo-Pacific. So the idea of the connection of the two seas, something that came out directly from former Prime Minister Abe, and now everyone is thinking in those terms. So it's incredibly remarkable for a country like Japan that used to be reactive, and now we are all thinking in Japanese terms. So that is really big news, especially on this side of the Atlantic, by the way. I agree entirely on the point of convergence in defending the liberal international order. Everyone is in his own way, but EU and Japan recognized is important, and how much we are sort of forced to be more active, and therefore everyone is in his own way, and his own particular ways, particularly when we talk about EU. These ways are maybe not familiar and conventional for others, but are important as well, as you have highlighted as well. I wonder, though, how much of this is not just China, but how much of this is kind of edging against the fear of abandonment on the American side. So the experience of going through the Trump administration and the potential that something like that returns, if it's not Trump again, is DeSantis or another form of sort of populist administration in the US. I wonder how much of all these things that we are discussing are associated with that possibility, aside from the obvious issue with the rise of China and all the consequences and the war in Ukraine that are more evident drivers of all these developments that we see. So that is, I think, something, if you want to comment on that. One other issue is associated with the current situation that we face with Russia and China. Especially, we see, of course, Kishida going to Ukraine, but especially Xi Jinping going to Moscow. And the first reaction on both sides will be, okay, Europe, United States, NATO, Japan, we are all defenders of the liberal international order. This polarizes a lot. So this leads to an idea there is now a new monolith formed by Russia and China that has different values, different ideas, and increasingly aligned. I wonder whether this, though, runs counter another strategic interest. This is less associated with a normative understanding, but more strategic in the fact that more the two are united, more is a problem for those who have to deal with them, especially with Japan. And this is something that Abe, as you mentioned, clearly in mind. The problem with that was really having a monolith of massively armed, large nuclear-powered hostile powers in front. So the issue at that point is how to separate them, at least diminishing the degree of cooperation between the two. This doesn't necessarily mean, or doesn't mean, at least on my side, advocating being soft or either of them, but we have to sort of think in terms of how to avoid, for instance, China cooperating massively with Russia on Ukraine, because that would generate a conflict that never ends. Therefore, there is a clear interest in making clear on both sides that the cost would outweigh the benefit when it comes to cooperation, especially if it goes into feeding the conflict in Ukraine. That would be a massive problem. Therefore, a lot of thinking looking forward on both sides probably would touch upon this issue. How can we avoid create or further in the situation in which the two increasingly align and they feed conflict in Ukraine, and the situation could feed other problems throughout the world, really. So this, I think, is an important issue when we can approach Russia and China in terms of values, and that is two sides, clearly, the West versus authoritarian countries, or thinking more in strategic terms, and the picture gets more complicated. Another fascinating point, getting a bit more on the Japan-EU side of your presentation that I found extremely insightful. One question is on Brexit and the UK. So that you mentioned, and in your slides, the UK came first and then all the other partners, but all of a sudden then the UK is not in the EU anymore. And from the self-perception of the UK, then in a certain sense, now they feel more free to do their own things, to be the global Britain that they want to be, which is clearly aspirational, maybe a bit delusional sometimes. But then they start also to do other things like AUKUS, which gives them a massive projection in at least in terms of prestige in the region. So I wonder what is the Japanese perception of the UK now, whether it's a more active partner that is more willing to engage, or simply a state that has lost something and then sort of running to recover a bit of the old glories. And same thing that I found very fascinating, and I entirely agree with you on this point, on the need of mutual knowledge and understanding and familiarity when it comes to Japan and the EU. Because the EU is a really weird beast. Okay, so even someone knowledgeable and skillful, as Abe was, as you said, was not familiar with the EU. Because the EU is not particularly good at presenting itself. So, I mean, it's complicated, rotational chairs, and then you have to meet three people to meet the guy is actually three different people. And at the same time, there is the same problem in a completely different way in Europe, where you find a lot of elites, political elites, that would not get that you cannot be the best friend of Japan and China at the same time. So understanding that the two have problems, and those problems can reflect on what you do, and you should be aware of that, and then you can choose. But still, you cannot have 100% on both sides. I think it's something that has to come, and then there is probably work to be done on academia, think tanks, and sort of quote-unquote our jobs in terms of spreading knowledge on those things. But really an issue of familiarity, of understanding the other side in a way that is conducive to better policies. And this is sort of to tie everything together on the issue that you said, European approaches to the cooperation in the security field and diplomatic field more broadly. As you said, probably Europe will not do much in the case of contingencies in the Taiwan Strait or somewhere else in the South China Sea and so on. But something that can happen, but is not entirely given or natural, is alignment, as much as Japan aligned with NATO on Ukraine. If something happens in Taiwan Strait, it's not given at all that the European Union would do the same with Taiwan, Japan, or anyone else that is involved. And that is an entire sort of political, diplomatic work that should be sort of planned and thought about in Washington, but also in Tokyo, probably. So in that case, the lesson of Ukraine, the lesson of the Japanese reaction to Ukraine, and South Korean reaction to Ukraine, by the way, as well, can teach us something, but it's not entirely given that if we reverse the situation, the same thing would happen. So another probably issue to discuss. I will stop here, and I think, again, thank you again for the very insightful presentation.
You want to respond? And then we have sufficient time for Q&A. Yeah.
Well, thank you for those comments. And actually, I should say that I wish this was even more of a working paper. It's not even at that yet, but I would like it. I hopefully will turn all of these thoughts into something more written, because I think it's, it's worth appreciating just how much has been done, but also how much there is to do. So thank you for and all comments really welcome to try to hone this. To the first point, the Indo-Pacific point, it really is remarkable, actually. So Mike Green's book on sort of Abe's foreign policy, Line of Advantage, talks about this point in particular, about how remarkable it is that Japan now developed this concept and has convinced all of its partners basically to start using it. And sort of now, and with that, I guess, with the language comes sort of Tokyo's map, right? That trying to create, which, if we're thinking about it, is now trying to create an East Asian order that really has India as a major player in it, right? If we're looking at what it's actually trying to achieve, and now there's kind of consensus around that. So I agree. It's really a remarkable thing that not just the United States. And actually, not just the United States, but administrations of both parties in the United States now have decided to use this, of course. But now we also see it used in Brussels and in European capitals. So I think I agree; it's a remarkable development. On the hedging against the United States, clearly, Japan had to be very careful. And I think Abe felt he had to be very careful in how he opposed things that the Trump administration did that he didn't like, starting with pulling out of TPP. And I think, and as I said, Japan's foreign policy starts with the relationship with the United States. I think, they look at Japan's environment, and that if the United States were to leave the region and were to stop its commitment to defend, that Japan's alternatives look pretty grim. In those circumstances. And so everything starts in that. Japan's going to go a long way to try to keep the US happy with Japan. And so even when there are areas where Japan is at odds with the United States, it has been careful about how it has pursued that. And so, clearly, I think there was a sense, during the Trump years, that Abe wanted to be between the Europeans and Trump, when there were disputes. That famous picture is the emblematic illustration, right? That he's sort of standing there a little off to the side, kind of between. And but also, it's also just worth remembering that I think the takeaway from the Trump years in Tokyo was that actually we can manage the United States, like that even which I don't think is clearly was not, I think, the case here in Europe, and I think. I have not heard, I think, I wouldn't say that Tokyo is unconcerned about the US election in 2024, but they're certainly not speaking very loudly about it. And I certainly think, at least in some corners, they think we managed Trump once. Surely we could do it again if we had to. Although maybe there's some questions about Kishida versus Abe's skillful Trump whispering. So it's, I think it's hard to say that Japan's behavior went as far as like an outright hedge, because I just don't think I think even getting to a point of thinking of a world where they couldn't rely on the United States is really thinking the unthinkable as far as their choices are concerned. This question of Russia and China coming together, it certainly puts Russia, or Abe's Russia policy, I think, in a certain light. I mean, and the strategic logic of Abe's Russia policy, I think, made a lot of sense. I mean, I think it was very much, and we've seen this. I mean, this is a very old line of thinking on the Japanese right of looking at Russia as where Japan could express its strategic autonomy. I mean, even when it was the Soviet Union, you had conservative Japanese leaders looking to Russia as a possible partner in the region. Maybe, wishful thinking, and I think in Abe's case, it became pretty clear he was not going to get what he wanted from Putin. But you could understand that if it meant keeping Russia and China from drawing too closely together and becoming sort of a monolithic challenge to Japan's security, that it was worth the effort. It certainly becomes harder now. And frankly, they might have more to gain by trying to pry China away from Russia than the other way around now. I mean, clearly, I think that if there's a possibility, China still benefits from the global, I mean, it's still plugged into the global economy. I mean, it still has something to gain from its trade and investment relationships with Japan, the EU, and the United States. And so, signaling to China the cost of being too closely enmeshed with Russia, is clearly, I think, the goal. And also, there also need to be carrots and sticks, right? And I think in the United States, the conversation now is all about the sticks and all about inflicting ever greater punishments on China. But clearly, there needs to be a discussion about what China has to gain from its access to the global economic order. And I mean, maybe under Xi Jinping, I mean, Chinese leadership has changed and its priorities have changed, and those arguments aren't going to carry as much water as they did before. But clearly, I think there needs to be approach on that basis. And so I think you're right. Trying to prevent them from becoming sort of a more monolithic bloc, I think, is imperative. On the Britain question, I think Japan appreciates Britain. I mean, I don't think they're overvaluing what Britain brings, but they also, I mean, Britain is a capable military power. It's probably easier to work with than the EU. I mean, I think, even with sort of political challenges domestically in the UK, I mean, I think it's a more coherent government for Japan to work with, and it certainly can bring more military hardware to the table. I think there's a certain amount of appreciation that it's certainly better to have closer ties with Britain than not. I mean, you also could say, bring Britain, sort of clearing the way for Britain to join CPTPP. I mean, that has been a priority for Japan as well. So, I mean, I think, Japan has sort of rolled with the punches. Britain chose a different course, and rather than complain about it, I think they've tried to find a way to make it work. I mean, on the last point, obviously, I'm in complete agreement. I mean, I think there's a need to have these discussions now about what alignment in the event of a crisis would be. And it just, it requires just a little more courage and a little more ambition in both Tokyo and in Brussels to actually have those discussions and to really step up the frequency of those communications and the intensity and the depth of those conversations. So, you all have your work to do pushing the European Union in that direction.
Fantastic, thank you. Now I'll open it up to the floor for discussion and questions and comments. We've had a very rich, broad brush overview on how Japan is a flag bearer of the rules-based international order in words and facts and words and actions, and how this fits potentially with the possibility of linking up Europe and Japan also, not just to hedge against the risks associated with China's rise, but also, this was your last point, which was fascinating, coming from the German Marshall Fund, Deputy Director of Asia, of strengthening that bond also to better shape, you could say, the options of US foreign and security policy vis-à-vis China, and how this is also captured by its domestic politics. So I don't want to abuse my position as chair, and I would really welcome any comments and questions. And please introduce yourself. Yeah, Axel, Bea, and Sil.
Thank you, Giulio, for putting us here together in the same room, and thank you, Matteo, also for the comments. And of course, above all, thank you to you, Tobias, for your presentation. Just just 2 or 3 brief points. The 2018 EPA SPA. Yes, okay, sure. It was U.S. under Trump, and there might have been this element of let's get this done now, to send a message towards the Trump administration. But then again, the adoption process was really going according to the timetable essentially. So that would have taken place anyway. Yes, there was a lot of talk. We talked about this, Julia, in our conference on EU-Japan. A lot of talk about this is the message that the EU and the Japanese sending together towards the US under Trump, which of course is very different now. Hopefully will remain different now. But I don't think there was an element of a real element of hedging at the time, because it was really going according to plan. It has been negotiated until 2013, both agreements, and then it was adopted. However, then you're right again. Then you said, look, this was supposed to be, supposed to have been the big bang of EU-Japan cooperation. But then you look at the track record, and we have done this, a couple of times, and I've just written another chapter on this, book, working paper. It's the last time I'm doing this, because there's not much to write about. Because if you really look, honestly, jokes aside about the EU efficiencies and being a big, corporation, a big organization, nothing is getting done. But if you look at the actual track record, I'm sure you've done this, of what the EU has done from 2018 to now with Japan on anything, the track record is very, very unimpressive. And you look at the EU-Japan annual review of the joint committee. This was to be the meeting annually where things were done. They read the same. This year's they are identical. Honestly, it's a bit of a joke, but not really funny. Sure, we're on the same page now with Ukraine, and things might be changing. But the actual track record, they say all the right things together, but the action, and again, we have been repeating this a lot of time, is very limited. And there are no joint actions. Okay. Last thing, 2019, the EU-Japan, joint quality infrastructure, a big bang summit, right? And that's 2019. Sure, COVID came in the way, absolutely. But I've been trying to find out recently whether there are any joint EU-Japan infrastructure developed. There are none, okay? And this is despite BRI and China and being a counterweight to all of this. They're making all the right noises, but the actual, projects on the ground are not there. Sure, Japan is getting interested in NATO, right noises, but the actual track record is very, very modest, right? Full stop. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly to that. No, that's why, as I have on the slide here, that I think they've said the right things, but there's a long to-do list. And what I will say also, what's kind of remarkable with that is that the change in Japan from having, been sort of a reactive country for so long, to now sort of being the country that's sort of pushing everyone to do things and look what we're doing. Look, we've done, quality infrastructure. Look, we're all over Southeast Asia. That Japan is sort of trying to push everyone else to meet its level of activity is, really a pretty dramatic change. And maybe it's a recipe for frustration that Japan now is looking at the world. And this, I think, also to some extent reflects Japan's domestic political circumstances, right? It has political stability that's probably unmatched in the G7, and we can talk about whether that's a good thing or not. Then whether Japan needs maybe a little more instability if it means more political competition. But the fact is that it has had political stability, and that I think has given it an ability to both articulate what it wants to do and actually execute. And that I think is definitely a recipe for frustration with partners that can't match that. And that is, I think. That is probably going to continue. I think Japan's domestic politics are going to be the way they are probably for some time to come. And so the question is, can its partners perhaps find it within themselves to step up?
And if I may actually abuse the power of the chair, I very much agree with what Axel has mentioned. But Japan, for instance, has taken the lead on trilateral, with regards to the preservation of free trade and open world economy. It has taken the lead in bridging the gap between the EU and the US when Trump was in power. It has taken the leadership role in initiating this anti-state subsidies initiative at the WTO. And now this is recent news from basically a couple of weeks ago. Japan has joined the EU in the dispute settlement arrangement that the EU has launched as a stopgap measure against the US sabotage of the WTO's appellate body. So, I mean, I agree with you. There's a lot of sloganeering, the Green Alliance, the Connectivity Partnership, absolutely. But, yeah. And I subscribe to the idea, yeah. Please.
And that is, of course you're aware of this, Japanese contributions to EU CSTP missions in Mali or Congo. There is some, and that was really, we're all very happy about it. There's something to write about, Japan has been doing stuff. But then you go back to the institutional level, this should be taking place in the Framework Partnership Agreement, the FPA, which have been talked about for years and years and years. Nothing is getting done. And Japan has done stuff ad hoc cooperation on the ground, and and the SDF has cooperated with the European military on the ground and helping, and police training in Mali and Congo, stuff like this. And that's great. But then in the bigger picture of and you have such an ambitious SPA. It's been negotiated for 7 years. And then you wind up, writing, the annual review, which is identical to the one you read last year. Anyway, I shall. Anyway.
Yes, I'm Silvia Menegazzi. I am a lecturer in International Relations and Asia Studies at Lewis University Department of Political Science. Many thanks for the invitation, and of course many thanks also for your insightful presentation, Tobias. I have a comment and also a question about what you were telling us today. I agree on the fact that sometimes it seems that in terms of substance there is still much lot to do with regards to EU-Japan relations, but I also think that to have a very solid normative basis for that cooperation is also key. So, for instance, we saw that that is actually missing at the current moment with regards to EU-China relations, and is a problem. But I also think, and to some extent, you were mentioning the fact that EU passed as it was defined, for instance, as a normative power, is something that has many similarity, for instance, with how Japan thinks in terms of the liberal international order. But of course, as Axel was also mentioning, you need substance. So my question is, for instance, how do you think that Japan could play or will play a role with regards to the reconstruction of Ukraine, so in a post-war scenario? Because, for instance, with regards to Ukraine reconstruction, there is already a discussion among EU member states, and it it seems clear that they are not 100% aligned, for instance, plus there is, of course, the United States. So how do you think that Japan could fit that picture, in the sense that do you envision, for instance, that Japan would like to play a more single and key role with regards to Ukraine reconstructions? Do you think that there could be a space for increase actually cooperation with the European Union? And what about the United States? Because in this sense, like for Japan, it could be a little bit, it could find itself in the middle between the EU and then the United States. Thank you.
I think certainly, I think Japan intends to play a role. I mean, I think, and I think it's, it certainly has the institutions and is capable of doing it. I mean, I think, that, I think it's hard, when until we have a picture of what kind of either the end or the stalemate looks like. I mean, I think until, when there's an active war, I think it's hard to see Japan getting too present on the ground. I think that's just going to be a limitation until we know what that looks like. If it's a Korean War situation, or whether there is some sort of peace settlement that's possible. How long this goes on. I mean, I think that is going to be just a constraint that will prevent Japan from being too involved. And I think in general, I mean, clearly, it's going to be, Japan can't lead on this. This is, Europe's doorstep. I mean, this is going to be, Japan having to play a supporting role. But I think it's just sort of the natural outgrowth of what we've seen over the past year, that Japan is not, does not view this as something distant and irrelevant, that, it wants to support Europe not having, a failed, devastated state on, in its neighborhood, and wants to, to facilitate Ukraine's reconstruction. But, also it's worth recalling that, whenever Japan approaches any development assistance, not even reconstruction assistance, but, often wants to create opportunities for its companies. And so, that I think inevitably also then raises the question of, Ukraine's status, and its relationship with the European Union, that, are there going to be opportunities for access to, to the EU common market if, Japan is, investing and providing development assistance in Ukraine. So I suspect that will be the discussions on Tokyo's end when it comes. But I think first it's just a question of how does the conflict unfold, and is there, does it reach a place where really you can move ahead with reconstruction, without it being sort of an active war zone.
Yeah, and of course, sorry.
No, please.
Sometimes I also feel a little bit uncomfortable in discussing what would be the reconstruction of Ukraine, but we have to face that, of course, this is already a discussions that states are having internally and at the EU level, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm Beatrice Gallelli, Assistant Professor at Ca' Foscari University and China Fellow at the International Affairs Institute, a think tank based in Rome. I'm a China specialist, and I work specifically from the point of view of discourse analysis. And I found your presentation extremely interesting, but I was wondering, I have a precise question. What's the difference between the discourse where, like, the US proposing this Manichaean vision of democracy vs authoritarianism, and the Japanese discourses on like-minded people? What are differences in terms of, like, for instance, in my view, the fact that Kishida decided to go to Kiev soon after the visit of Xi Jinping in Moscow was clearly symbolically say where Japan stands. So it was like, we are on the right side of history, so to speak, while China's side is on the wrong side. So I was wondering what are the differences in terms of contents also, for instance. Thank you.
Sure. Well, so the timing, I don't know how much of the debate about the timing of that a Japanese leader has never visited a war zone before, and every trip abroad by a Japanese prime minister has to be approved by the Diet. And so, but then there was a question of that if there's advanced approval, will you be able to provide security for the prime minister because it's a war zone? So there was, he was supposed to do, I think this was supposed to happen actually in January, and word was leaked, and then it couldn't happen because of the security concerns. So then there was some sort of exception made where he could basically inform the Diet after once he was on the ground or after the visit, so that he could actually do it without word being leaked and not being able to do it. And so it was actually, I think it was completely coincidental. I mean, and so had this happened in January when he had wanted to do it, no one, of course, would be talking about the contrast. I mean, I think that was just really just something of a fluke of Japanese domestic politics and how prime minister, sort of the constraints on the prime minister. But I mean, there are actually, I think, important differences. And in fact, Tokyo, people in Japan are very uncomfortable with the autocracy versus democracy frame, and generally don't like using it. And again, the frame, the language that's actually in the national security strategy is some countries that do not share these values, which I think is important because it means, like, for example, Japan does not want Vietnam to think we've put you on the other side because you're not a democracy. If you look at the speech that Kishida gave in India this week, talks about how Japan and India both are capable of understanding other countries and listening to other countries and more tolerant. And that, I think, is the difference. That I think what they want to stress is that the difference is very specific, about very specific policy issues and ways in which China and Russia, through their behavior, are undermining rules and norms. That and that this is not a clash of civilizations. That this is, or really even of systems per se. It is these countries are doing things, and they provide the list of things that are contrary to our vision of what the rules-based international order should be. And so that I think they are very reluctant, to have this be, very stark, either a civilization divide or a clash of systems. That is not how Japan wants to think of this, because also, the moment you start putting countries, forcing them to choose, well, you're autocracy or democracy, you might not like the choice that some countries make. And so I think they're very careful. And also, frankly, as far as the Japan-India relationship goes, if we're talking about that, at least there's some in the United States who say, how can we talk about India as a democracy even, and they look at Indian domestic politics. You never hear people in Japan, certainly in elite circles in Tokyo, expressing concerns about Indian democracy. Have you heard anyone say anything? No. I don't think that they're so, not that I think it's stopping American elite, Americans in elite circles from pursuing closer relationships with India, but you do hear it more in the United States than you do in Japan. So maybe that's not a good thing, but there's a certain realism and pragmatism, I think, in Japan's approach to this compared to the United States. And it is, I don't know if it's a source of friction, but it is a source of some discomfort, I think, in Tokyo when it comes to how the United States is framing this versus how Japan is thinking about it.
Yeah, even the special advisor to Kishida on human rights, Nakatani Gen, didn't really end up in the limelight very often in the news, meaning that his role has been effectively hollowed out altogether because of this Japanese pragmatism, in foreign and security policy. Perhaps you want to,
Hi, Marco Zappa, Ca' Foscaro University of Venice, assistant professor in Japanese studies. Huge Tobias Harris fan. Sorry for this personal note, but I think I learned a lot throughout my years as a researcher, just looking at your Twitter timeline. So thanks a lot. It's a great honor and pleasure to have you here and to meet you in person, actually. I would like to go back to probably, the last points of your presentation and the discussion, and to a certain extent also to Axel's questions. About getting Japan and the EU, to work together more efficiently, maybe. I've done very little research in this area, but in my perspective, at least, there seems to be a huge hindrance in the perspective. The perception that both the EU and Japan have of each other. In the sense that speaking to just once to an Italian diplomat, there's still the picture and the sense that Japan is not a diplomatic priority. Because, of course, for example, for Italy, and Italy is part of the EU, but it's a Mediterranean country, the diplomatic focus would be Mediterranean, North Africa, Middle East to a certain extent. On the other hand, we have Japan, and of course, we all know that Japan's diplomatic focus is mainly in the Asia-Pacific, it's mainly in Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So how do you think, we might, get the idea, a different idea to policy-making arenas, and how do you think this kind of perception of each other might change in a way? And is this alleged China threat enough to change the perspective, to change the mutual perception that still is there? Just to throw up another piece of information, I think the last foreign minister of Japan to come to Italy and to actually participate in a kind of a think tank policymaking event was Kono Taro at the ESP Med into 2018, and he just said, yeah, the Mediterranean is our priority because we catch a lot of tunas there, right? So it's fundamental for our sushi culture. But I don't think that that didn't have a segues in a sense apart from that. So I just want to hear your thought on this. Thanks.
I think there's a really interesting point there where. In this relationship, in some ways, Japan is a supplicant, and now we've kind of come back to this point about, Japan sort of in a world of continental-sized powers and how it navigates that. And clearly, it is in a situation now of kind of, and I think now rightly that its attention should be on Brussels, because ultimately it's now trying to convince a continent-spanning institution to take Japan and its concerns seriously and to see the points of commonality. That's why there's probably relatively little Japan is going to be able to achieve on a bilateral basis with European countries, unless, of course, France has colonies in territories in the Pacific. Britain would like to think of itself as a Asian power still. And so on. But I think to the extent that those bilateral relationships, it's probably as much about probably shaping intra-EU politics as it is about anything specific that Japan could hope to get from a bilateral partner in Europe. But also, as Japan looks to diversify where its companies invest, I think clearly Europe is probably going to be a beneficiary of that. I was looking just at the numbers. Europe is still kind of far behind in terms of where it ranks as a recipient of Japanese FDI, but it's, as those patterns change, clearly I think, and probably the European periphery stands to benefit from that as well. I think South and East probably stand to gain, to the extent that they're still looking, for lower costs and obviously access to the single market matters. So, I suspect that if there is an area where on a more bilateral basis, there's going to be opportunities for engagement with Japan, I think that is probably where it is. But I think when we're thinking sort of in the broader strategic picture, clearly getting the EU to at least punch its weight is probably more of Japan's priority now when it looks to Europe than anything in particular it's going to get from a single member state.
Fantastic, and on that very Brussels effect note of exporting standards and norms and joining hands with Japan, because we live in troubled times that really need a refresh of global norms and standards and tackling global governance with a modicum of shared principles. I will close this very stimulating discussion. I thank you all for coming. We are actually right on time. We're 1 minute late. And stay with us. If you have joined for the double bill, be aware that we are going to have another lecture in half an hour, which is actually a matryoshka of a lecture, because we'll introduce 3 new books and discuss them on East Asian politics, actually, Japan and China. Thank you.